It's my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Mary Yates. I'll tell you a little bit about Mary. She retired from the foreign, the Foreign Service after a distinguished 31-year career spanning 3 major geographical areas, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Started her diplomatic career in Korea and the Philippines, where she was on the team negotiating to maintain U.S. military bases in the 1980s. She spent 4 years at the U.S. Embassy in Paris, pretty good gig. Served more than a decade in Africa, including as ambassador to Burundi and Ghana. While in Burundi, she worked with Nelson Mandela on the peace process. Mary served as the first ever civilian deputy in a regional military command. In 2009, she brought those skills back to Washington, D.C., where she served President Obama as special assistant and then as senior director for strategic planning. Mary is not an IT expert. She's not here for that. But she's particularly well suited to address the theme of this conference, embracing disruption and preventing dysfunction. She's done so throughout her career and has done so with great success. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Mary Yates.
Thank you very much. You were terrific. On my water. Good morning. Very good. Thank you, Mike, very much. That was a kind and generous introduction. First, I have to say, I love being here in Sacramento, and especially this morning when it stopped raining. But this is a very interesting renovated part of the city, so I have to go home and tell my husband about that. After that introduction from Mike, you're probably turning to the person next to you and saying, am I at the wrong conference, or what planet did she come from? This doesn't sound like it matches with your conference, but thank you, Mike, for making the connection. I have lived through a lot of disruption, and I've tried to make sense out of dysfunction, and I'm not just talking about the State Department sometimes. But I also hope that I'm going to be able to share some stories that you can take some lessons away from. I better get back on my script. I do hope that you're going to be able to network today and talk about why you can embrace disruption, because sometimes it makes you recalibrate the way you've done things all along and be able to find a new path. You know, when you're overseas and bad things happen, it's forced upon you. But I often saw that we had to embrace that change, and I'm going to give you many examples. I said I had the privilege of working with the U.S. military closely for 4 years, and I learned that generals have a lot of old war stories they like to tell, but you ain't seen nothing yet till you've heard an old ambassador. We even have more stories sometimes. Before I sort of line up my aha moments when I learned a lot, I want to take a step back and explain what a U.S. diplomat does overseas in case that's something that's not quite clear. That's where the world I lived in for the past 32 years. I worked for the Department of State, not the state, as many of you do, and I served as a Foreign Service officer, just like a military officer, and we swear our allegiance to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States before we take off overseas. And at any given time, there are about 9,000 U.S. diplomats, Foreign Service officers, overseas around the world. And what are we doing? We're promoting American values. We're trying to promote American business overseas. We're building coalitions with allies. And we monitor positive and negative trends that could affect the homeland and our security here. I think it was former Defense Secretary Bob Gates who said, we need both the shield and the sword to protect our nation and keep us safe. And diplomacy is seen as the first line of defense, the shield out there. In fact, those of you who are history buffs probably know that the first two government agencies were, at the time, it was the Department of Foreign Affairs that became state, and secondly, the Department of War that became the Department of Defense. And even back to the time of the Founding Fathers and the Continental Congress, you know, we sent Benjamin Franklin on the diplomatic mission to France to enlist their help so we could succeed at our revolution. There's the word you like. At our revolution. And so, of course, George Washington had to use the sword as well. But I think that this just kind of shows you a little bit of the background of what diplomatic work is. One reason I take a moment to explain this is we moved recently, after multiple years overseas and living in Washington, D.C., up to Vancouver, Washington, and I would meet people, and they'd say, oh, what did you do? I said, well, I was a Foreign Service officer for the State Department. And more than once, someone said, oh, I knew somebody who was in the Forestry Service. I said, no, the Foreign Service. And they said, and what state? I said, the State Department. So now I've backed that up. So I'd like to frame my lessons, which I hope have some resonance in this conference. But before, let me say something about leadership. And Mike, I enjoyed listening to so much of what you had to say. It's applicable in many forms. I learned in my 32 years as a diplomat that leadership is absolutely critical to making any of these changes happen. And leadership was not about me. It was about listening to other people, whether it was foreign governments, whether it was people in peace parties, my own embassy staff, even my own family. Leadership is not about you. It is trying to lead others to really do something together for the greater good. So I'm going to divide my lessons today into 3 buckets and try and move through them. The first one is the importance of collaboration and team building. The second, how to tackle those huge, almost insurmountable tasks and jobs that you're given by breaking them down into manageable parts. Sounds like that's what we did with the budget. And the importance of crisis planning. So I'm going to be talking about faraway places and people, but I hope you find some similarities to your work here in California. And I have to say that California is respected worldwide as really the vanguard and always being in the forefront on innovation. So I think your state government will be looked to that way as well. So let's get started on this first basket, and that is coalition and team building. Well, Mike said that I had the privilege of working with Nelson Mandela, and so I got to watch him as a master build a peace process. He had stepped down in 1996 from being president of South Africa and took on, which he didn't need to take on, heading the Burundi peace talks. Geographic note, Burundi, small country in Central Africa, next to Rwanda, next to Congo on Lake Tanganyika. And all of the 3 years that I served as U.S. ambassador in Burundi, 99 to 2002, the country was at civil war between the 2 major factions, the Hutus and the Tutsis. They were killing each other at a rapid rate. In the decade-long war, over 300,000 people were killed. This is not a big known fact. It's sort of just swept away in history, sometimes conflated with the Rwandan genocide. But so where would you begin to try and bring these 2 warring factions together and solve this problem? Well, it wasn't my job. I was just an observer as the U.S. ambassador. But to watch Nelson Mandela do this was something else. I learned lessons I used in the rest of my career. First of all, you remove the fighting sides from where they are. So the peace talks were held outside of the war zone where there could be a peaceful setting for them to get together. Secondly, it was President Mandela as the facilitator who set the tone and the task for every session. And he would run the plenary. I said sometimes like an old schoolmaster, you know, shaking his finger at these warring factions. But he didn't let them speak in the open session. He then went and met with each one of the groups, different representative groups. He heard them, and they came to arm with all their grievances that went on for decades. He would listen to them, so they could always go back to their supporters and say, yes, he listened to us, he heard us, you know, so they could stand up to their own supporters. But then he would give them some counsel and tell them in private that their positions weren't exactly right, or they had to move, they had to change, they had to look at it a little bit differently. And everybody had talked to Mandela, and he would go back into the big session. Oh, the other thing is, by breaking it into pieces, we never tried to deal with the entire peace process at a time. He would say, we're going to talk about the economic future of the country, we're going to talk about the political future of the country, or how we're going to power share in the future. And so that would be the task he would go around. Then he would come back to the general session, and he'd say, well, we consulted on all of these subjects, and there's a convergence of thinking. You never knew exactly who said what, but he moved the ball forward, and you know, who was going to fight him anyway? So it was amazing how step by step, inch by inch, he could move that peace process forward. I'm not, my husband's the first one to say, I'm not a patient person. I kind of like to get things done. This was, you know, for all 3 years I was ambassador, I went to Arusha for these peace talks every month, and I thought, this is like moving molasses. But that's what it had to be, and there was another big secret, is when you bring people together over a period of time who don't like and don't trust each other, they begin to trust each other. They begin to have confidence because they were building something together. They were building the peace for the future. And so it was wise, and it was wonderful to watch him. Let's see if I can get back on my script here. And actually, it was about a year after I departed in 2002, the peace process was signed. They'd come up with a power sharing arrangement, and it was quite remarkable. So Burundi, I like to say, was my first rodeo as a peace process, but it wasn't my last. And I learned a big lesson from the next one, too. The same MO in the sense that the war was going on in Liberia, but they had to bring the belligerents out of there and put them in the capital of the country I was ambassador in, Ghana. And so we would observe what was going on. And this, and in Sudan, I noticed that they were all men at the negotiating table that had been named as delegates. Well, they were the belligerents, you know, so that made some sense. But I didn't mean that unkindly. But even though we were observer nations again, I had a group of Western ambassadors at my residence, and we were trying to brainstorm ways to help the Liberian peace talks at the time. And lo and behold, these women, because they figured it out where we were meeting, and they decided to come and protest. So the guards came in and they said, there are a bunch of women outside the gate of your residence protesting, you know. I thought, oh, great, you know, so I went out. Who was leading them, if the name means anything? Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who later became the president of Liberia, their big head wrap, you know, and I went out and I said, yes, yes, I understand, you're protesting. We should be at the table, we should be part of this. Well, my takeaway is, when you are trying to build a peace and go forward, be as inclusive of all stakeholders as possible, because it saves you in the end. Who was going to really help in the post-conflict situation? Who was going to be the implementers of that? The women had at least 50% of that role. And I have to say, too, and I think I have the quote here, it was after Iraq and Afghanistan that in 2013, DOD issued guidance along the line. I think the quote's quite amazing, and I was amazed when this came out. This is DOD guidance. We must empower women, half the world's population, as equal partners in preventing conflict and building peace in countries threatened and affected by war, violence, and insecurity. Achieving this goal is critical to our national and global security. So that was a real recognition that they had to be brought in. But I saw it as another lesson of why you've got to be inclusive. And I won't go into great detail in Sudan, but just to tell you, as I'm still so passionate about Sudan, this is Khartoum, I've been there twice in the last 4 months, and I'm headed to Nigeria on Saturday to listen to what's happening with Boko Haram. But on the women in Sudan, they were not included in the peace process that was going on in Ethiopia, again, outside the country. So the women of the two countries that had separated, South Sudan and Sudan, came together, formed an agenda, went to Ethiopia on their own dime, made a pitch why they needed to be listened to, and of course they had a piece of paper that had solutions, real solutions that could be implemented. So they were included in the peace process. Okay, before I leave that basket, well, yeah, it's not all about war and peace here. A lesson learned about building teams and collaboration came from when I got to Ghana, excuse me, I realized it was a much, much bigger embassy. I probably had 200 Americans and about 500 local staff. And we had 19 or 20 different U.S. agencies, DOD, USAID, Peace Corps, agriculture. And as the ambassador, you sit and listen to what everybody is doing. And after a few months, I thought, there are real redundancies here. People are doing, there are many different agencies doing HIV/AIDS work or education and training work. But I also had learned that no agency is going to take direction from another agency out in the field or back in the States. And it was my job to try and orchestrate all of that so we could move forward on the strategic goals of the bilateral relationship, for the U.S. government. So I proposed, and this is where IT came in handy, I proposed that we have an information sharing horizontal teams. And they only had to meet once a month, but the idea was to share information of what they were doing. And pretty soon it was organic. Pretty soon they said, oh, well, if you're doing that HIV/AIDS program in that part of the country, why don't we prioritize and work over here? And the fact that they could hang a lot of this on a portal and share the information, then they didn't have to meet in between. I'm glad I don't have to look at that picture of me up there. It's awful big. All right, let me move on to the second basket, and that is how to tackle some of these gargantuan problems you're given. And I said, I had a lot of tough jobs in 32 years, but, and every time I had one that was complicated, it seemed to me I got one that was even more complicated. The two examples I'm going to talk about are building the U.S. Africa Command that Mike referred to, that was 2007 to 2009, and framing the writing of the national security strategy in the White House in 2010 for President Obama. I loved the first 2 years I worked with the military. I was serving as a foreign policy advisor and for two amazing four-star generals. I learned a lot of lessons from them, and I needed every lesson I learned when I was given the honor and asked if I would serve as the first civilian deputy commander in a U.S. military command. First of all, they're usually three-star generals or admirals. Second, I was a woman, and I was a civilian, so this was a huge honor. But then we were told that it had to be stood up, and using military jargon, that's going from IOC to FOC, initial operating capacity, to full operating capacity. And we had to do this. We had to do that in a year. But it wasn't just that. It was supposed to be half civilian, half military, and bring in a bunch of other U.S. government agencies. Well, that was unbelievable. There was no manual. There was very little support from the other services, I should say, lack of enthusiasm from the uniformed services, almost no resources, and we had a very angry African continent because the publicity was so bad they thought that we were building, some neo-colonial command that was going to try and orchestrate Africa. And then that got started, so the American academics and think tanks just said, this is a really bad idea. I said we had incoming fire from all quarters. So we get to the Pentagon ceremony in October of 2007, and my four-star boss, myself, and the three-star admiral head back to Stuttgart, Germany, and report for duty the first day. and there wasn't, I had a phone on my desk, and I had a phone on the aide's desk, and they weren't connected, but it was okay because I didn't have an aide anyway. They hadn't been hired. So this is how it started, with just less than 300 people. And what we, I think, learned, I'm not going to bore you with all the gory details of this stand-up, but what we had to do, the 4 of us senior leaders, the 3 of us and the chief of staff, we had to divide, we had to prioritize the missions, we had to stay in close touch, and when we hit roadblocks, we had to sort of talk them through. Obviously, we were talking about human resources and inboarding the personnel, coming up with a mission transfer calendar, reaching out to the African nations so they understood what it was we were trying to do, and then building some knowledge about Africa in the command, because this was a different AOR for many of the military. I virtually had no HR experience at all, and I'm talking to HR people at the Pentagon and other agencies all over Washington. You know, you just do what you have to do. But the most important thing was we saw the end goal of where we had to be. We looked at a calendar. We divided it up. What were going to be our quarterly goals, what were going to be our monthly goals, and then we took the small handful of people we had and picked the most effective leaders, divided the work, and then trusted them. You know, they were all trying to do the same thing you were trying to do. We had to have a lot of information sharing meetings, but you can't do it alone. You've got to divide it, and then you've got to sort of check on it. Oh yeah, the other thing that we spent an enormous amount of time on was personal outreach. But I don't think you can over-communicate. When there's already such a misunderstanding of whatever the mission is you have, just keep talking to people. So we'd go back to DC, we'd go to the services, we'd go down to the continent and try and explain it. We had an academic, roundtable meeting to try and explain it to them. And you just get used to getting beat up, but pretty soon people began to understand. Everything about this was hard, very hard. And sometimes we thought the morale was flagging a bit. And so the 4-star said, we're going to kind of have a pep rally one day. And I will never forget what he said. He said, he was Army, great guy. He says, look at the person on your right. He used to talk about his foxhole. Look at the person on your left. And he said, what have you done this week, this month, to make their mission more successful, to make their task more successful? And I thought, that's really interesting, because everybody felt like they had enough to do on their own. But in other words, this team's only going to make it if we're pulling all the oars in the same direction. So I took that as a lesson in life. If you can lead other people to believe that what they do to help someone else who is in your section, your department, you can usually accomplish something better. So that was by October of '08, we had the command. I think we had 1,000 strong, not 1,200. And we were getting to the real mission of what we created, which was working with African militaries to partner in security. And we were standing up this West African maritime training mission, which was fabulous. And we even had a DEA rep there, which was important because many of the drugs come in through that part. And an energy department rep because of the oil and the protection of the oil in West Africa. So I thought, oh, this is pretty good. And I thought, I'm really going to look, we were getting a few more resources. We could get planes to fly to the continent. What a unique idea. And so I thought, this is great. I have about 6 or 8 months that I can enjoy the fruits of this labor. Wrong. One of these great 4-stars I'd worked for ended up as the National Security Advisor, General Jim Jones, fabulous human being. And he said, Mary, I'd like you to come to the White House, I said, okay, General Jones, what would you like me to do? And he said, I think I'm going to put you in charge of strategy and the national security strategy. Right. I mean, I go from one gargantuan task to the next. The interesting thing about this was, he says, you're going to have a staff of 4 to do this. But in June of '09, no one had been hired. I went into this office, small office. There were 4 other desks there. And I thought, this is really not going to be easy. But I sort of figured out I had to get information and procedure down and get that organized. And in the National Security Council, it's in that big building right next to the White House. And on the top floor, there's a beautiful little library. And I found in that library all of the last national security strategies that they were started in the late 1980s. And all by myself, I brought them down, spread them out on the table, to the table of contents. And I thought, isn't this interesting? Our national security priorities, no big surprise, haven't really changed that much. Of course, they morph and they change some, but not really. So I thought, this isn't so hard if you've got all of these sets of goals that you have to try and define, but every president comes in and nuances and has some priorities. So then the next thing I had to do was, and again, my lesson here is, look and see who else is doing something similar. Of course, DOD had to be reviewing all of their priorities for their quadrennial review. The budget people, OMB, had to be looking at the budget to review it for a new administration. So there were other voices and informed documents that were being sort of generated at the same time that helped me. I keep moving along. Oh, yes, I was going to make one comment when you referred to the LA Times. Besides getting the document together, the building blocks, which we did, but that took from June of '09 to May of '10 when it was published, you have to get it cleared. And this is cleared by all the agencies of government. But my recurring nightmare was that I was going to wake up and see it on the front page of the Washington Post. Before the president had a chance to clear it. So you had to find a way to get the agencies to approve their part of it or something that would be relevant without seeing the total picture. Anyway, that was a whole second process. So let me turn now to crisis management. It's a little more closely related to your subject. And what I like to say is, you can train and you can exercise for crises, but you will never get the crises you train for. But you're still going to be better off having done the training and the exercise than not having done it. And I think that's really important to instill in the people who work for you as well. I mean, we talk about risk management, and whether it's in business or in government, whether it's risk management of protecting an embassy, or it's FedEx delivering their packages, or you delivering water or services, the disruptions are going to happen, and trying to find ways to mitigate those risks is a responsibility in any kind of work we have. And I was, here comes another Burundi story. I was ambassador in Burundi, and this is because I said it was a war zone. We probably had gunfire that we could hear in our residences maybe once a week. You know, the rebels would come in over the hills, and there was different sounds at different times. So the State Department said to me, I think I'm going to send you a crisis management team to do an exercise for 2 days. I thought, I do not need a bunch of people coming out here from the State Department telling me how to manage a crisis. We're living in the middle of a crisis. We have an emergency action committee. We have an emergency action plan. Why do we need to be told by these two people for 2 days? And I've got real work to do. So I kind of fended them off. And then it was like the next month, one night, oh yes, and we had our own personal readiness as well. I had an armored vest under my bed. I knew which wall in the house was the thickest, where I was supposed to go, in case the rebels were ever coming that close. So this particular night, it wasn't just, you know, kind of quiet gunfire. It was significant gunfire. And then at one point I thought, it sounds like they're outside the bedroom windows there, you know. So the security officer and I had this conversation, and he said, remember our drill? I said, yeah. And he said, is the vest under your bed? I said, yes. He said, put it on, crawl over there by that wall, and I'll be down as soon as the gunfire subsides a little bit. I said, okay. So I did that. We executed. He came down. but then you have to. You can't have that happen in your country and not let the State Department Ops Center know. You know, that's a no-no. So I called in. Well, needless to say, the next week they said, we will be sending that crisis management team out there to do an exercise. But I was the first one who really appreciated what we learned from the exercise. And I didn't understand why it had to be 2 days, you know, because in the first part of the exercise, they set up all these problems and issues. And again, takeaway from me, you may think you have a plan, but until you exercise it and you check, for example, the list of phone numbers of who to call in an emergency, try them. Try and see how many are accurate and still work. They probably don't, you know, and then the assigned roles. Everybody was given a role for the time of a crisis. Well, first of all, the org chart of your organization could have changed. They may not have the same roles. You may have somebody who is a loose cannon. You don't want them in that role, you know, so you need to redo that list. And then, I mean, for us, for you and your businesses, it would be place of assembly at the time, excuse me, of a crisis. For us, we had named a place where the helicopters could come in and evacuate us. Well, it was in the emergency action plan, but in this management exercise, we had to go check them out. Well, of course, a big building had been built in the area that we had designated as the helicopter landing pad, so that wouldn't have been so great. So doing the exercise is important, and it gets you more ready and more prepared, even though what happens, and again, I never had to go through evacuation when I was there. Oh, last thing on the emergency preparedness. I also think that training to do something that you never thought you could do in an emergency not only builds your confidence and the confidence with the people, the small group of people you do for that training, and is very useful in the time of crises. For example, when we were in the Congo, Zaire at the time, the security people, and it was a pretty tense time, the security people said, we'd like to have a half to a third of the embassy folks know how to drive the Zodiac boats across the river to Brazzaville, so we had one more way to escape. So they took volunteers who would do this. At that time, I was also the wife of the ambassador, even though I had a job in the embassy. So I said, oh yeah, I'd like to learn to drive the Zodiac boat. So we went for our daytime training, and I never realized how many rocks and shoals and things they were to figure out how to get across the river, but we succeeded. Then they did, about a month later, nighttime training. That was not fun, and it was really scary, and I'm glad we didn't ever have to evacuate that way. But it was an absolutely great experience, and it built such camaraderie within the embassy. All right, now I'm on to my last point. How am I doing on time? Oh, not bad. In my conclusion, I mean, I know you wonder why they ever asked someone like me to speak to this IT conference. I'm still taking Mac classes at the community college, so I'm trying. But I want to give you two examples of why your work is so important and how even globally and in some of the jobs I've seen, IT solutions can be the solution to solve problems that can't be solved any other way. The first example was when I was at the White House and I was in the job as the senior African advisor for President Obama, and that meant I led interagency meetings often. This was on Somalia in 2011, the crisis in Somalia, and the Al-Shabaab terrorists had blocked good parts of the country. So we knew there were women and children and families behind that line that everyone was afraid, USAID was afraid of massive starvation. We couldn't get the food aid in. So some bright, smart techie types over at USAID figured out how to come up with electronic vouchers. So behind the enemy lines, of a sense, there was food, there were food supplies there, basic food supplies. So if once a month they could get on their phones, they could get the electronic voucher, they could go to these stores and buy the essentials. Therefore, until the military, actually Burundian peacekeepers, which is interesting how they changed, they moved some of the al-Shabaab back, and then they could get more of the food relief supplies. But this was a clever and innovative way to get food to people by just using technology. And the other example was President Mugabe in Zimbabwe is a dictator and is brutal and cruel to those who oppose him. And so there was an NGO, an IT NGO, who was working with a group of women in civil society, and they came up with a way to send text messages, but without the exact information, because if it were found on their phones, they could be jailed or beaten or abused. So there were codes that they would send to each other about where the oppression was going on, or if there was an incident, where the insecurity was occurring. So it kept many of those people, the vulnerable, away from trouble, just through this clever device. Now that's about the limit of my IT knowledge right there. I just want to thank you for inviting me to come to this conference. It's a real honor, and I hope you have a wonderful networking time. I'm happy to take questions, but I'm not sure we have time for that, but I appreciate being here very much. Are we done?
I got 5 minutes if you'd like.
5 minutes for questions? Okay.
We have about 5 minutes, so if you've got that didn't take long. Hold on. So if you have a question, raise your hand. As soon as she starts answering the last question, I'll come find you, okay?
Hi, I heard a story on NPR, I think yesterday, the day before, about the federal government wanting to upgrade their computer systems. And one reporter said that since our computer systems are kind of old and outdated, that it might be wise to leave them outdated because the hackers would not be able to access the old systems. Do you have any opinion on having like low-tech emergency plans or going forward with really high-tech and new operating systems and computer systems?
Well, I'll give you a very quick answer because I started in the government when they were still doing the carbon copies of typing up things, and I was there when the internet was invented, and then we got email, and then we got classified email, and then, so I saw quite an evolution. One thing that I would say, having had the privilege of also working for the US military, where there are many more firewalls and safeguards in military, but then being at the White House when there was yet another set of security and firewall, but we knew we were being, the hackers were coming in at the White House on a daily basis, multiple times. So I think what someone has to sort of decide is, how much classification do we need? How can we communicate what is important? Because I think the hacking is going to come, but I do think the systems need to be upgraded, but that takes a lot of money. I don't know, and I'm not an IT specialist, but I do think we've got to try and guard against the hackers, but realize that it's going to come. I don't know about that idea. We got rid of the Wangs, at least. That was a long time ago.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I don't know about that.
Anybody in here that thinks they have a tough job, unless you have to evacuate on a Zodiac, I mean, really. One more warm round of applause, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.